It's Halloween season, and I figured on the Rad Book Club I would feature a book about witches, witch hunting, and women by Sylvia Federici. This book was published in 2018, and although I don't usually read the back of the books before I do the readings, in this case I'm going to make an exception. So, from the back blurb, we are witnessing a new surge of interpersonal and institutional violence against women, including new witch hunts. This surge of violence has occurred alongside an expansion of capitalist social relations. In this new work that revisits some of the main themes of Caliban and the Witch, Sylvia Federici examines the root causes of these developments and outlines the consequences for women affected and their communities. She argues that no less than the witch hunts in the 16th and 17th century Europe and the New World, this new war on women is a structural element of the new forms of capitalist accumulation. These processes are founded on the destruction of people's most basic means of reproduction. Like at the dawn of capitalism, what we discover behind today's violence against women are processes of enclosure, land dispossession, and the remolding of women's reproductive activities and subjectivity. So Sylvia Federici, for those who don't know, is a feminist writer, teacher, and militant. In 1972, she was co-founder of the International Feminist Collective that launched the Wages for Housework campaign internationally. Her previous books include Caliban and the Witch and Revolution at Point Zero. So I'm going to read the chapter here. This is a relatively short book, but I'm going to read the chapter entitled Witch Hunts, Enclosures, and the Demise of Communal Property Relations. I'm actually going to read the whole chapter, and it's really fascinating because it gives us a sense of where the phenomenon of witch hunting came from, especially as it related to women being dispossessed of their land and their previous rights, several hundred years ago. Now, stay tuned to this video at the end. After the reading, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on in our society today. I'm going to talk a little bit about how right now the banker Prime Minister Mark Carney is introducing policies and affecting policies that are going to be extremely detrimental to women. So stay tuned to the end of this video if you're interested in hearing a little bit of a rant about what the Canadian context is, and join me as I read Witches, Witch Hunting, and Women by Sylvia Federici. The English enclosures, and more broadly the rise of agrarian capitalism, starting in the late 15th century Europe, provide a relevant social background for understanding the production of many contemporary witchcraft accusations and the relation between witch hunting and capital accumulation. I will clarify later in what sense I use the concept of enclosure. Here, I wish to stress that land enclosures cannot explain the totality of witch hunts, past or present. I agree with the prevailing view that witch hunting requires a multi-causal explanation, though I trace all of its underlying motivations to the development of capitalist relations. I also do not wish to suggest that the connection I establish between land enclosures and witch hunting is a necessary one. It is only under specific historical conditions that land privatization produces persecution of witches. There seems to be, however, a peculiar relationship between the dismantling of communitarian regimes and the demonization of members of the affected communities that makes witch hunting an effective instrument of economic and social privatization. Enclosures were an English phenomenon whereby landlords and well-to-do peasants fenced off the common lands, putting an end to customary rights and evicting the population of farmers and squatters that had depended on them for their survival. This was not the only means by which land privatization took place. The same process of expulsion of the peasantry and commercialization of land occurred in France and other parts of Western Europe, for instance, through increased taxation. I focus, however, on the English enclosures because they more clearly show how the commercialization of land and the rise of monetary relations affected women and men differently. In this usage, enclosures include the engrossment of land, the introduction of rack rents, and new forms of taxation. But in all its forms, this was a violent process, causing a profound polarization in what had previously been communities structured by reciprocal bonds. That it was not only the lords but the well-to-do among the peasants who raised the edges, the common form of boundary marking, intensified the hostilities the enclosures produced. As the enclosures and the enclosed knew each other, walked the same paths, and were connected by multiple relations, and the fear that consumed them was fueled by the proximity of their lives and the possibility of retaliation. What evidence do we have that land enclosure is a major factor in the production of witch hunts? The answer is that most of the evidence is circumstantial. In none of the trials of which we possess the records were the women accused described as victims of expropriation. It is acknowledged, nevertheless, that in the rest of Europe, in England, witch hunts were predominantly a rural phenomenon, and as a tendency, they affected regions in which land had been or was being enclosed. Although he later retracted his claim, in his Witchcraft in Tudor and Stuart England, Alan McFarlane had shown that the map of the witch trials and that of the enclosures coincided. The main area for the persecution being the county of Essex, where the land had been enclosed at least a century before the witch hunt. Enclosures had also occurred in Lancashire, especially near Pendle Forest, the site in 1612 of one of the most murderous witchcraft prosecutions. The memory of this enclosure was reflected in the name of the village where some of the witches executed were first examined, which was properly called Fence. Chronological considerations are also important. They show that witch trials did not begin in England until the 16th century, peaking in the 17th century, and that they occurred in societies where economic and social relations were being reshaped by the growing importance of the market, and where impoverishment and rising inequalities were rampant, all becoming harrowing in the 1580 to 1620 period, when, under the impact of the silver coming from South America, the prices of grain and other agricultural goods began to rise. Older women were most affected by these developments, for the combination of rising prices and the loss of customary rights left them with nothing to live on, especially if they were widows or had no children capable of or willing to help them. In the rural economy of the English manorial society, widows and poor people in general had been provided for. As Keith Thomas has written in Religion and the Decline of Magic, the old manorial system had done much to cater for widows and elderly people by a built-in system for poor relief. The widow enjoyed the right of free bench, that is, of succession to a portion of her late husband's holding, ranging from a quarter to the whole, according to local manorial custom. Should she be incapable of cultivating it herself, she could surrender it to a younger member of the family in return for a guarantee of maintenance. There were also various local customary privileges of the poor, varying from the right of 3 days of gleaming before the stubble was given over to pasture, to permission to sleep in the church if they had no other accommodation. Peter Leinbach has also shown that since the Magna Carta, and in particular the Charter of the Forest of 1215, the widow's right to estovers, that is, the right to food, wood, and sustenance, was guaranteed. But with the loss of customary rights, this too was forfeited. At the very time when the Reformation and the new commercial spirit forbade the giving and receiving of charity, begging being allowed in England only upon concession of a license by the justices of the peace. Not surprisingly, many so-called witches were poor women who survived on begging from door to door or lived off the poor rates, as the first system of welfare introduced in England was called. Even the crimes imputed to them demonstrate that they were part of a peasant population that no longer had access to land or customary rights and could be expected to resent their neighbors' possessions, beginning with their animals, which may have been grazing on land that had once been a common. Significantly, At least 2/3 of the charges recorded by C. Lestrange-Ewan relative to the home circuit for the period between 1563 and 1603 were for bewitchment of pigs, cows, horses, geldings, and mares, several to death. As I wrote in Caliban and the Witch, the poverty of the witches was noted in the accusations, as it was said that the devil came to them in times of need and promised them that from that point onward they should never want, presumably offering meat, clothes, and money, and payments of their debt. Poverty, however, was not the immediate cause of witchcraft charges. Two other factors contributed to the making of a witch. First, witches were not only victims. They were women who resisted their impoverishment and social exclusion. They threatened, cast reproachful looks, and cursed those who refused to help them. Some made nuisances of themselves by sudden, uninvited appearances on their better-off neighbors' doorsteps, or made uncalled-for attempts to have themselves accepted by giving small gifts to children. Those who prosecuted them charged them with being quarrelsome, with having an evil tongue, with stirring up trouble among their neighbors. Charges that historians have often accepted. But we may wonder if behind the threats and the evil words, we should not read a resentment born of anger at the injustice suffered and a rejection of marginalization. To the economic factors that are in the background of witchcraft accusation, we must add the increasingly misogynist institutional policy that confined women to a subordinate social position with respect to men, and severely punished any assertion of independence on their part, and any sexual transgression as a subversion of the social order. The witch was a woman of ill repute who in her youth had engaged in lewd, promiscuous behavior. She had often had children out of wedlock, and her demeanor contradicted the model of femininity that through the law, the pulpit, and the reorganization of the family was imposed on the female population of Europe during this period. At times, she was a healer and a practitioner of various forms of magic that made her popular in the community, but this increasingly signaled her as a danger to the local and national power structure in its warfare against every form of popular power. Whether their remedies had any efficacy, possibly based on empirical knowledge of the properties of herbs and plants, or were placebos made of charms and incantations, is not relevant here. That the populace tried to influence the course of events through sorcery and other dubious practices was enough of a threat at the time when enclosures sparked revolt and turned farmers into vagabonds and beggars, plausibly eager to turn the world upside down. And women participated in many protests, pulling up the fences that now surrounded the commons. In the witch, the authorities simultaneously punished the attack on private property, social insubordination, and the propagation of magical beliefs, which presumed the presence of powers they could not control, and the deviation from the sexual norm that now placed sexual behavior and procreation under the rule of the state. That the devil had to be called up to justify the operation remains baffling, unless we assume that only through their demonization could forms of behavior that in the past had been tolerated or viewed as normal be rendered odious and frightening in the eyes of a broader population of women, to whom the death of the witch served as a lesson of what to expect should they follow her path. And indeed, many women learned the lesson, and as the witch hunt progressed, also contributed to the accusations. Yet they rarely denounced the women suspected of witchcraft directly, playing instead a passive role, being pressured to testify by men, who usually initiated the legal procedures. It is perhaps through this confrontation, opposing women to women, that we discover the secret of the persecution of witches and its particular relationship to the destruction of the commons. It is fashionable among historians today to assume that those who were killed were not innocent victims of a monstrous institutional persecution that was similar to the extermination of the heretics or the Nazi persecution of the Jews in modern times. We are also told that some women took pride in their reputation as witches to extort favors and resources from their neighbors. It is suggested that charges such as spoiling ale-making, bewitching the cow, or causing the sudden death of children were not unsubstantiated. But if indeed there were women who readily committed such deeds, shouldn't we ask what drove them to so fiercely hate some of their neighbors as to plot to ruin them economically by killing their animals, spoiling their trades, and inflicting deadly torments on them? How do we explain that in villages where a century earlier life had been organized around communal structures and whose yearly calendar had been punctuated by collective festivities and celebrations, such hatred had arisen? Or was the demonization of the witch the very instrument of these divisions, necessary precisely to justify the ban against individuals who once had been considered and had considered themselves as commoners? Be that as it may, together with the witches, a world of social, cultural practices and a belief that had been typical of pre-capitalist rural Europe, but which had come to be viewed as unproductive and potentially dangerous for the new economic order, was wiped out. It was a world that we now call superstitious, but that at the same time alerts us to the existence of other possibilities in our relationship to the world. In this sense, we have to think of the enclosures as a broader phenomenon than simply the fencing off of land. We must think of an enclosure of knowledge, of our bodies, and of our relationship to other people and nature. Another aspect that has yet to be fully understood is how the witch hunt changed our relationship to animals. With the rise of capitalism, a new social ethos developed that prized the capacity to discipline and channel one's instinctual desires into labor power. As self-control became the mark of humanity, a more profound differentiation was introduced between humans and the beasts, amounting to a cultural revolution if we consider that before the advent of capitalism, a continuity was assumed between the animal and human worlds, animals often being deemed responsible beings who were even endowed with the capacity to speak. As late as the 16th century, this view of animals persisted in many parts of Europe, so that dogs, for instance, were brought to trial for crimes they had committed, or as witnesses in trials for their owners, capable to assert with their behavior their innocence or guilt. By the 17th century, a drastic change was underway, reflected in Descartes' theory that animals are non-sentient machines. Having companion animals was increasingly treated with suspicion, animals being depicted as the embodiment of that uncontrollable instinctuality that capitalism had to curb to produce a disciplined worker. Touching them, caressing them, living with them, as had been the norm in rural areas, became taboo. With the witch hunt, especially in England, animals were demonized, according to the theory that the devil provided his acolytes with daily helpers in the form of domestic pets, serving to carry out the witch's crimes. These familiars are a constant theme in the English trials, as evidence of the irrational, bestial nature of the witch and potentially every woman. Through the witch hunts, then, a new social and ethical code was imposed that made any source of power independent of state and church suspect of diabolism and brought the fear of hell, the fear of absolute evil upon the earth. That its embodiment was commonly assumed to be a woman was to have profound consequences for the condition of women in the capitalist world that the witch hunts helped to construct. It divided women. It taught them that by becoming accomplices of the war against the witches and accepting the leadership of men in this regard, they could acquire the protection that would save them from the hangman or the stake. It taught them, above all, to accept the place assigned to them in the developing capitalist society. For once it was accepted that women could become servants of the devil, suspicion of diabolism would accompany a woman every moment of her life. So, as we've learned from Sylvia Federici's book, the phenomenon of witches and witch hunting was supercharged, if you will, by the process of the land enclosures and the privatization of the commons in the United Kingdom. And, you know, you might think, well, that's hundreds of years ago and it doesn't affect us in our time, but of course it actually does. I mean, to this day, we have the dispossession of Indigenous lands here in Canada as part of a continuing project of settler colonial white supremacy. I mean, it's happening today. It's never stopped. And what we're seeing right now with our banker Prime Minister, Mark Carney, is the advancing of policies that are going to do tremendous harm to women. Now, what am I talking about? The increased militarization, right? The massive funding of our nation's military will not just harm the women and the children and the men of countries where that military goes to fight, but it'll also harm the women, and of course the children of military families. It'll harm the women who live near military bases and so on. Something similar happens in terms of the extractive industry. So as we go on this project of nation building, where we're going to make it easier for the corporate vampires to suck the resources out of our land, to push Indigenous people away and Indigenous resistance away, well, of course, that's going to harm women. That's going to have a direct harm for women. We see that in the man camps that are populated by the men who work in these areas, and we see that with the environmental destruction and the social violence that we see happening in Indigenous communities where resource extraction is happening. So all of these policies are intrinsically bad for women, and that's before we even start to talk about the defunding of programs and the defunding of social services that are relied upon by women in this country. One of the first things that our banker Prime Minister did was to abolish the Ministry of Women and Gender. We could ask why he did that. And we could ask why he and his government are advocating austerity policies that are going to harm women more than anyone. And specifically, of course, women of color and Indigenous women. Thank you very much for watching this video. Please subscribe, and we'll see you in another video. Ciao for now.